guys, I have talked about reading on this channel, I've talked about learning other languages on this channel, and today what I thought I'd do is put those two things together and talk about reading in different languages. I've read a ton of books in my time, lit major, so the list is pretty extensive. Most of that stuff has been English language literature, or it's been stuff that's been translated into English, but I have read a little bit of Spanish literature for classes as well as just a little bit on my own. When I started learning French a couple years ago and now I'm living in France and I'm getting fluent, I've started reading more and more in French. Right now my focus is pretty much on French, so all the things I'm going to mention in this video are French literature, or at least translations into French, but this hopefully can be applied to basically any language that you might want to learn. This video is just going to be all about my experiences with it, some sort of pros and cons to different types of books, different genres, just basically what I've experienced in all of this time of trying to read literature that's not in my native language. So the first piece of literature in French that I ever picked up and tried to read was The Little Prince, which a lot of people are probably going to know because I do think it's fairly common to be read translated into other people's languages as well, not just in French. This is also one that some of my friends who took French in high school, for example, read in their classes. A couple of things here that I think made this book a really great choice to start out on, because when I picked this up, my level was probably not as high as most people's are when they attempt to start reading. I'd say that people probably wait, well, for example, I think the people who I knew who read this in high school read it in their French 4 class, I believe, so it would have been their 4th semester of French before they ever picked up an actual French text. That wasn't something that was written specifically for non-native speakers. So that's a couple of years worth of French before you actually get into it. For me, I've never taken a French class. I was probably about an A2 level when I started reading this, so I was pretty much present tense only. I think I was starting to learn one of the past tenses. This book, I believe, is written in that past tense as well as one other, but they're the two spoken past tenses in French. Most French literature is written in a third past tense, which is one that people never use and you don't use when you write emails or anything like that. So it gets kind of complicated when you're starting to read French. Depending on what language you're trying to learn, this may apply, this may not apply at all, but I would definitely say watch the tenses before you pick up a book. If your level is very low and it's really complicated tenses that the book uses, you're gonna find that stuff that you might even be able to understand becomes massively complicated just because a verb that you already know is in a different form and you don't know how to recognize it. And that could really, really mess up the entire story because there's a verb in every sentence, literally. So pay attention to that definitely when you're starting out and picking a book. The next one I read was actually an audiobook, so I listened to it, and there are definitely some pros and cons to doing audiobooks as opposed to regular books. But first I want to talk specifically about that book that I chose. I did the Hunger Games, all 3 of the Hunger Games, and I listened to all of them on audiobook. I didn't read them with the actual print, but I could have definitely. The reason why I think the Hunger Games was a great choice and why I recommend definitely for you guys who enjoy young adult or sci-fi types of books, it's a great choice. It's because it's in present tense. The huge majority of literature published, at least in English and Spanish and French, I can't, I guess, speak for every language, but a lot of it's going to be written in past tense, some sort of past tense. Obviously tons of tenses are used in the speech and the narration, etc., but the majority of the story is going to be written using a past tense. For the Hunger Games, obviously, like I said, in certain dialogue and stuff they mention and use other tenses, but the majority of the narration and everything is all present. So it's using forms that you're already familiar with at a very early stage in your language learning. There are some things that are less practical, like some of the terminology I didn't really need to know. When you have sci-fi / fantasy types of novels, then you're going to have some vocabulary in there that is really just not practical at an early stage because it's literally completely made up fictionalized stuff. But overall, because there are literally verbs in every sentence, I think just the perk of having present tense makes up for so much. So I think it's definitely a great place to start. As far as listening to a book versus reading a book, I think there are definite pros and cons to both. Listening to a book probably is more challenging when you're starting out unless you have a really good comprehension. When you're reading, you can go at your own pace, you can pause on the words you don't know and stop and look them up. But when you're listening, I mean, you can pause the audiobook and look something up, but you don't necessarily know how it's spelled. It can kind of pose some challenges that you don't have when you're looking at the words on a page. So you do have to have some patience with that, but because listening comprehension is one of the most important parts of learning a language, I think it can definitely help. So I highly recommend it. You just have to have a little more patience and perhaps be a little bit on a higher level than what you might think for the level of the text that you're choosing. And that works out perfectly because the next book that I want to talk about is The Three Musketeers. Yes, the one by Alexander Dumas from the 19th century. This one did pose some problems, and I do think it maybe was not a good choice for the level that I was when I started it. The biggest challenge that I found with this one is because it is an older text. It's not like Shakespeare old, but you know, a lot can change in 150 years or however many years it's been since that was written. You'll notice this, of course, when you look at text in your own language. It's pretty remarkable. The language changes a lot, the uses change, the slang. Sometimes there are literally things that just don't exist anymore. Obviously, Dumas is not nearly as complicated as Shakespeare, but it's still an extra challenge because it's not how people speak today, and the vocabulary is just a little bit different, and the style. It was still fun, I missed a lot of the story. Next, what I started working on was this Guillaume Zola book, and I have not finished it. I actually stopped partway through because I think I just kind of got tired of the story a little bit. Sorry to anybody who likes this author. This one is kind of a modern, off-the-shelf French author. He's written a ton of stuff. He's a really trendy author right now. I think this book was written sometime in the past 5 or 6 years maybe. So it's all very new. Because it is kind of pop lit, you don't have weird vocabulary and stuff. It's written to be taking place in modern times. It's written in the modern times, and it's for the most part realistic, although it does have kind of an aspect of, I guess, maybe magical realism in it. But for the most part, it's pretty realistic, and I think that is definitely a good thing to start with, especially if you're not already a huge fan of fantasy or sci-fi, because when you're reading in another language, it will be very easy to think that you misunderstand stuff and potentially actually misunderstand stuff. And when it comes to fantasy, if you read, you know, something magical appeared and then swallowed up the entire city or something, that legitimately could be happening in that novel. But in a realistic type of book, if you read that, you probably know, okay, I misunderstood something there because that can't happen. That's physically impossible. The thing is a little bit over 600 pages. That's huge, but because the style is very simple and it's stuff that a fluent French speaker could probably pick up in no time, then that's acceptable for, you know, the publication. But as somebody who started this when I was about a B1 and I'm only now about a B2, it's a little bit challenging because it is very long, it's hard to kind of get into and stick with, and I don't have that ease of reading that everyone normally will have when reading it. So that would be probably one of the challenges with it, but I'd still overall recommend something like this, something pop lit. It's how people speak today, and yeah, it's very easily digestible in that regard. The last book I'm going to talk about in this video is the one that I'm currently actually reading. So if I pick up a book in French right now, it's going to be this one. And it is, let me see, actually I forgot already the name, Les Chevaliers d'Emeraude. So this is a young adult fantasy. So this is my genre. I love this genre. It's potentially the one I've read the most in English, except I guess I've read a lot of classical literature for my classes and stuff. I'm almost halfway through it right now, and it is a little bit of a slow read because it is fantasy. And like I mentioned earlier, sort of the doors are just open for anything to happen, and a lot of stuff does happen that's really kind of weird in this one because it's high fantasy to top it all off. Everything takes place in this magical world. Everything that's happening is completely fictional. It has creatures of different types. There have been several words that I've had to look up because like I learned the word for squire, for example, which is something I would have learned in older texts as well, even if it's not fantasy, but it's not something that I would ever use. But the plus side about this is that it is young adult, so the vocabulary itself and the sort of style of writing is very familiar to me. It's fairly straightforward. It's not too picturesque or poetic in its speech. If you want something that's maybe a little bit more easy to grasp than young adult fantasy, you could try a young adult, just kind of pop lit style, like a typical young adult with no fantasy elements whatsoever. And if you already like the genre, I think that makes a huge difference. If you're just picking stuff because someone recommended it to you, but it's not your cup of tea typically, then I don't think you're gonna really enjoy it. And when it comes to reading in a different language, it's really important that it's something that you enjoy. So pick something you like, pick something that you're going to enjoy actually getting through and enjoy discovering, or pick something that you've already read or you've watched a movie for so that you know that you're going to enjoy the story already. Those are pretty much all the French texts that I've attempted in the past couple of years, so I'm gonna wrap it up there. I hope sharing my experiences and my pros and cons and just sort of giving what advice I can give, I hope it's helped you guys in your own reading and your own language journeys in whatever language it is that you're trying to learn. I'd love to know a little bit about your experiences with this, so let me know in the comments what language it is you're trying to read in, what your native language is. I would just love to know about your reading journeys or your language learning journey so far. If you'd like to see any videos similar to this in the future, definitely let me know that in the comments, or send me a tweet or leave me a comment on Instagram. I would love to know just what you guys are interested in relation to these things. I love books, I love literature and reading. I'm learning French obviously and Spanish, so these are things that are all extremely close to my heart, so I love talking about them. I love making videos about them. So just let me know what you guys want to see. Thank you guys all so much for watching. As always, I'm I'm going to get on to drinking that coffee back there that's been sitting there this entire video. And I've sort of thought about it a couple of times, and I've thought about grabbing it, but when I get talking, it's very hard to get myself to stop talking. So I'm gonna go enjoy that now. Thank you guys all so much for watching, as always, and I will see you soon.